Welcome back. India is experiencing a devastating second wave of the pandemic, with horrific scenes of death and despair. The economy was already suffering, and the latest crisis is only adding to its challenges. So how does corporate India navigate the current emergency? What policies should be implemented to accelerate business recovery? Sharing their insights, and what a tremendous panel this is, we have Amitabh Kant, Chief Executive of India's Planning Policy Agency, NITI Aayog, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, Executive Chair at Biocon, and Malika Srinivasan, Chair and MD at Tractors and Farm Equipment, and Keshav Murugesh, Group CEO of Global Boardroom partner WNS Global Services. We now join your host for this session, our South Asia Bureau Chief in New Delhi, Amy Kasman.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning from New Delhi, and welcome to this session. We have a lot to talk about. This session is coming at a very, very difficult time for India when it's in the midst of a very serious COVID-19 second wave, which is having a big impact on business. It's very different from the shock that India experienced last year at the beginning of the pandemic. We have and it poses a lot of challenges also for India's competitiveness and raises questions about the future direction for India's economy and for businesses. We have a fantastic panel here today to discuss the issues confronting the country. And I'd like to start by asking Malika Srinivasan of TAFE, how you're experiencing this crisis and the shock of the second wave this year, and how it differs from the shock that India experienced last year when the country abruptly went into an overnight lockdown in a bid to try to contain the virus.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. No doubt, India's giant second wave has been quite a tsunami with a difference, because I think a tsunami hits, leaves carnage behind and leaves. This one has continued to roll inward and is causing a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. You referred to the lockdown of last time. The lockdown of last time gave us time to stop, think, pause, and it was a very new experience, and plan and act. So I think we put together a playbook with government rolling out reforms in a number of different packages to ease the pain that we saw last time. With all of that, industry as well, we developed a playbook, how to deal with supply chain disruptions, how to get our network partners up and running, and to reorient ourselves to a huge investment in terms of work from home. So in that sense, do we have a playbook to deal with this second wave? Yes, perhaps from that sense we do, but there's been a big difference. And I'd like to point out two differences. One, last time, rural India was by and large unaffected by the COVID pandemic. This time, there's no such difference. Again, in the cities, we had hotspots and we had safe zones. All of that has just disappeared. So this time, and looking at it from an industry perspective, while we continued some of the COVID practices that we had put in place, almost anticipating from the experience of other countries that there would be a second wave, I think we have new challenges primarily dealing on the humanitarian side. We are having to balance priorities, and we're having to focus as leaders, focus on providing all that support to our employees, to our loved ones, near ones, dear ones, and their families as we balance priorities. And I think the humanitarian side has come into very strong focus because there is a sense of not so much being in control of our destiny. Those would be my opening comments.
Thank you. And Keshav, how do you see, and at the IT services and BPO sector, see the differences in your experience of this wave and the concerns and issues that you're facing compared to the disruption of last year?
Sure, Amy, again, thanks. And it's wonderful to be here, with this panel of movers and shakers of India. Going back to 2020, the first thing I must say is Indian IT and BPM are all the time focused on ensuring that our clients are preparing for tomorrow, today. That's the first statement I want to make. And for us, therefore, when, in March, when, this tsunami of COVID struck, this industry is traditionally prepared for what we call business continuity planning. But in this particular case, it was a pandemic that hit the whole world, every client, every country at the same time. And there was no model called pandemic continuity planning. And therefore, we had to really scramble overnight, working with clients, with our employees, and with the government. And I must say, the handshake between government and industry in terms of, first and foremost, understanding how important this industry was to India and to the globe and to clients across, and to ensuring that we were declared an essential service immediately. And overnight, we co-created solutions with our clients. And at that point in time, I was the chairman of NASSCOM, and I was actually hoping to retire by April and hand it over to Praveen, my Infosys colleague. But that whole month, we spent actually moving 4.5 million desktops to people's homes, ensuring that Wi-Fi models were as robust as possible, working with governments to ensure that on the ground we were not disturbed, and creating the models for cyber risk, operational risk, and other forms of risk, as a result of which clients understood that first and foremost, India was ensuring employees were safe. Second thing is, we sent out a strong signal that for us, saying that we could not run critical operations at a point like this was not possible. We kept the lights running. And finally, we also started preparing for future waves. Now, that model, I would say, did extremely well, because when we started, most companies couldn't even give guidances because clients could not project where their business was headed. But 1 year later, I will say that we have actually planned extremely carefully in terms of a second wave, potentially a third and a fourth wave. And I think that is the confidence we can give from an India point of view. The fact that we are focused on testing, tracing, with employees. We are creating, vaccination centers in our own campuses. We are, constantly communicating with employees. For example, NASSCOM recently had a session with the chief of infectious diseases at Apollo in terms of what employees should do at home, things like that. And more importantly, constantly communicating with clients in terms of why, in spite of all the negativity that they're seeing outside about this current wave with the COVID, that Indian IT and BPM actually is well prepared. And in fact, the industry and most players have actually, gone back to regular guidances for 2022 or 2021, knowing fully well that this COVID model is going to continue for a little longer. I'll end there by saying that we are extremely well prepared. And from that point of view, while we would like to see more vaccines being made available to vaccinate our employees and the community at large, other than that, we are well prepared, and we believe that we will be able to stave off the crisis, and we are giving a lot of confidence and comfort to our clients at this point in time.
Thank you. Kiran, as someone in the pharmaceutical sector, you're right in the center of the storm, aren't you? What is your experience of, for your company and for your sector, the experience of this year's wave compared to what happened last year during the lockdown and that disruption?
Yeah, so I think to build on what Malika just said, I think the first wave was like a major storm, and this one is like a tsunami. And I really believe that, where we were last year was about preparing for vaccine deployment. And, we were all sort of basically following certain protocols and procedures and, getting ready to deal with this pandemic through medical resourcing in a very different way than we are trying to do today. Today, we have the vaccine. Last year, we didn't have vaccines. And today, it's a question of how do we basically deal with this second wave in a manner that basically gets us to a safe place. As you know, India, and we all thought that we were in a very safe place at the start of the year, because we had seen the numbers coming down, we had seen very, very positive signals, business almost returning to normalcy, places were opening up, and then it hit us in a very unexpected way. And I think today we need to now look at how we now learn from this particular second wave and prepare for the next. And therefore, I think the pharmaceutical industry, the vaccine industry, we are all trying to ramp up, because we realize that the way forward is about, securing safety through vaccination. And therefore, I think the need to deploy vaccines, ramp up vaccine production, and ramping up medical supplies and medicines in general is the big challenge right now. We never expect such a surge demand, both for vaccines and medicines and medical supplies. So I think that's the situation we are all in. We're all focused on ramping up. We're all focused on how do we basically make sure that we are now prepared for such an emergency and an eventuality in the future. So I think this is what situation we're in today. And I think that the way things are going, I hope that in the next month or so, we should be back to at least a much better place, because right now there are lots of questions to be answered. We've been seeing that this virus is this time around not sparing anyone, irrespective of age, gender, ethnicity, or location. So I think that's the big challenge we have today. Last time around, we did believe that the younger people were more immune. We felt that people in rural areas were less likely to contract it, and so on and so forth. But this time around, no such luck. And therefore, I think we are being hit in all directions. And therefore, I also believe that we have many, many lessons to learn from this wave, so that we are much better prepared for the next wave. So, things like safety stocks, things like, making sure that we track and that there's much better surveillance on the pandemic are some of the measures we'll have to take. And of course, medical resourcing is going to be a big, big focus, I think, for the country at large, which I think the government is very seized of. And I think this time around, I think the public-private partnership that is coming to be is very, very large. And I think we also are seeing this as a collective effort globally, where India is seeing a lot of help and funding coming from all across the world, which I think is extremely important to realize that this is not about a pandemic that just hits one country. It can spread very fast. So we are all in it together.
Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to Amitabh. You're the CEO of the Indian government's primary, public policy think tank. Did the Indian government dropped the ball. And also last year, we saw a very strong leadership response from Prime Minister Modi, who before cases even began to take off, imposed a national lockdown. Yes, it was controversial, but it showed strong leadership from the center and a determination to tackle the pandemic. This time, in a way, the Prime Minister has appeared rather preoccupied with other issues that he has, including domestic elections. And he seems to have made a calculated decision to kind of now shift the responsibility from the response to the states. I'd like to ask you, what lessons was learned from the first wave of the pandemic and last year's experience, and how is that affecting the response now?
So, Amy, India had come out largely unscathed from the first wave of the COVID-19. We had calibrated lockdown and pretty systematic unlock phases, and we brought ourselves time to produce essential equipment and infrastructure at a scale that met not only India but also global demand. India by then had an encouraging recovery rate and probably one of the lowest infection and mortality rate. But, the virus mutation in the second phase its velocity has been absolutely ferocious, and the spread has been at a very rapid pace. And then we've had, in a democracy, we've had elections in some of the states. And therefore, the spread in the second phase has been at an enormous speed. We've also been able to ramp up our vaccination efforts. We've administered close to about 150 million people now, and we will be ramping this up very rapidly. The process of gene sequencing has also accelerated, and I think it needs to accelerate even at a higher speed. And despite the high number of cases and pressure on infrastructure, we've managed to keep the mortality rate low to at about 1.1%. It's just that the impact of the second phase has been so enormous that we've been fighting this battle with all the states. The first phase, we had a national lockdown, but we must understand that if you have a national lockdown, its impact is very severe on health outcomes, on learning outcomes, on industrial outputs. And therefore, in the second phase, the strategy has been that allow containment zones, because out of 740 odd districts in India, close to about 200 districts are badly impacted. There is no point locking down entire India and impacting young children, families, people below the poverty line. And therefore, we need to focus our battle in areas where the spread is very, very fast, and we need to contain them. And this battle actually is being fought in partnership, and that is the only way to fight this battle. Today, India is fighting this. The mutation is happening in India. This mutation will spread to other parts of the world as well, and therefore it has to be a global fight. What India is facing today, other countries will face. And therefore, it's very important that we work in partnership in pursuing global goals. And the global goals can't be fought with India alone. In India, we've seen the private sector has stepped up its production of medical equipment, oxygen, vaccines in response to the nation's need in very close coordination with the government. And it is with the same spirit that we'll continue working to handle both the COVID pandemic and India's economic recovery and then its growth story.
Turning to the question of India's economic recovery, I mean, it's unclear how long this wave and this massive disruption, caused by health is going to last. Right now, many companies are very preoccupied with just seeing to the health and welfare of their own employees, I know. But looking ahead to when this phase is over and again, the pandemic starts to abate and case numbers start to fall, what do you think is going to be the kind of the economic impact of this in the short run and maybe in the medium term? I'd like to start by asking Keshav. I mean, what do you think are going to be the scars of this very, very tough second shock that we're gonna see?
Sure. So I think the first thing, Amy, is that it's important for us to keep communicating across the globe that this is a pandemic that is impacting everybody. It's not just India. Now, India is in the news for today, right? But I'm pretty certain that over a period of time, people will understand that there are steps being taken at different levels to manage this pandemic. And in the next month or two or so, this wave, will be driven down. Personally, I think it's very important that each sector has to focus on doing what it can do the best, while also working with government and the communities at large to ensure that the critical requirements of today are also managed very well. And I can say that based on how some of the sectors have actually managed COVID phase 1 and also partially COVID phase 2, because this is now almost 3 months old, I will say that there's a lot of confidence, for example, in the sector that I belong to, the tech sector, because when people looked at how we responded to wave 1, they actually said that, these guys know how to manage this business, and we're actually seeing an expansion in business in spite of the fact that there is a wave still undergoing at this point in time. We had predicted that the West will come back faster because of aggressive, vaccination policies and things like that. And we may come back a little slower, but we had already worked with the government to do many things, including vaccination and campuses and things like that. So if you ask me, for example, this sector, even last year had a net hiring growth of 138,000 extra people. At a time where people were laying off jobs, we had a net hiring growth. This year, again, we expect to see higher growth. And overall, I will say that we're seeing demand come back dramatically because we're seeing hyper-personalization take off, which means analytics will take off and big data will take off in a big way. Contactless solutions will take off in a big way. Cost takeouts are required by every company across the globe. Cyber security solutions are required across the globe. And therefore, for Indian IT, using our mature models, the ability to grow beyond 7.5% or 8% of GDP is potentially a possibility.
Thank you. Amitabh, I'd also like to very much come back to you on this question. I mean, what does the government anticipate or see as the likely scars or damage to the economy or to India's competitiveness that will be inflicted by the current second wave? Do you think, last year we know that after the lockdown, demand came bouncing back much faster than many companies expected, because it really was, the lockdown was about demand suppression. Nobody could buy anything for the duration of the lockdown. And the minute it was relaxed, there was kind of a roaring back of demand. This time, you actually are seeing many families that are wrestling with kind of devastating health crises. The disruption is of a very different kind of nature than last time. And what do you think are going to be the scars and the kind of impact that this is going to have on corporate balance sheets, demand, and the banking system, which was already fragile? You're on mute, sir. I don't think anyone could hear you.
There has been a disruption, and this is a moment of crisis. And India can and must turn this crisis into an opportunity. The world is moving towards a new normal. And the pandemic, to my mind, has only accelerated this process. Even before the pandemic hit, new global supply chains were being forged. That was largely on account of the US-China trade war. But as the world now feels the full brunt of lockdowns and disruptions in global supply chains, I think the pace at which new supply chains will be forged will only increase. And both countries and companies will have to reevaluate their trade and manufacturing strategies, and they will have to look at new avenues for growth. To my mind, India has inherent competitive advantages, which India possesses. And my personal view is that India must become an integral part of the global supply chain. And this requires India to become extremely flexible, India to become extremely competitive, India to use this opportunity to fully digitalize and accelerate the pace of reforms. During the first phase, we carried out some very radical reforms, very major reforms across agriculture, medium and small enterprises, in terms of health, in terms of a range of areas, the bankruptcy code, several areas we carried out path-breaking regulatory reforms. We need to even accelerate this even further in the second phase. And I think that is really the key. Secondly, I think it's very important to understand that the future lies in use of technology and the future lies in digitization. And India quite often used to get into the sunrise areas of growth where it's very difficult to penetrate global markets. And therefore, we've launched several production-linked incentive schemes to boost the manufacturing of a range of areas, from mobiles, electronics, pharmaceutical, medical devices, to textiles, to food processing, to battery manufacturer. A whole range of them we moved forward so that India can become a global champion in these areas. But the key to my mind will really be the focus on infrastructure. And infrastructure will really hold the key, and creating world-class infrastructure in participation with the private sector will really hold the key to accelerated growth, and investment in infrastructure will lead to lower cost of logistics, further improving the competitiveness of our firms and our companies. And we've got a big pipeline of projects which form a part of the national infrastructure pipeline. And I really feel that there is a huge need to get into newer areas of growth: electric vehicles, battery storage, manufacturing. The future of mobility will be increasingly clean, connected, and shared. And India must be at the forefront of this revolution. There will be immense potential in artificial intelligence. India is data rich. It must become data intelligent. There will be huge opportunities in analytics, blockchain, cybersecurity, cloud computing, genomics, and all these applications all across India in both commercial and social aspects will create an enabling environment for these technologies to make India leapfrog. And India must solve for all its own challenges, but also for the challenges of the world. And this, to my mind, will be very, very critical.
Okay, thank you, Amitabh. I'd like to ask, before I turn to the next panelist, I just like to remind you that as slightly later in the session, we will be taking questions from participants. So those of you who'd like to ask our illustrious panelists anything, please do put your questions in the chat, and we'll be trying to find some of the most interesting and provocative questions to put to the speakers. But Kiran, I'd like to turn to you. Do you think that this second wave and the impact that it's having could potentially inflict damage either in the short term or the medium term on India's competitiveness, on brand India, on concerns of global business partners, that can India really deliver? Is it reliable? And what do you see as the issues that India is going to have to confront when the kind of immediate health crisis is over?
So, Amy, let me start by saying that this second wave is certainly a setback. We had a huge business confidence, setting in at the start of the year, but this has been a setback. And having said that, I would like to say that many sectors will not face the kind of onslaught that some sectors will. So, for example, because we are now forced into a digital virtual world, I think the tech sector, which is India's very strong business sector, I think will benefit out of what's happening the world over. So I think that is one sector that Keshav talked about, which actually it stands to benefit from what's happening in the digital world across the globe. When it comes to pharmaceuticals and vaccines, I think that is also an area where India needs to actually make sure that it doesn't lose its competitive edge. Because I think the world does need a massive capacity of both vaccines and medical supplies and medicines. And India certainly should not lose its leadership position in both these areas. And therefore, I think the name of the game is to see how do we invest more and ramp up capacity for global markets. In terms of other sectors, I think there is an opportunity, but I must make sure, like Amitabh said, is to focus on how do we become an integral part of the global supply chain. It's not going to be easy because I think countries and economies are going to assess the strategic priorities for them in terms of getting their own economies back to normalcy ASAP. So I think if India struggles to get back to normalcy because of the second wave, it might sort of put us in a less competitive place where in terms of where we want to be. But if we actually do a good job of getting over the second wave sooner than later, I think it will make us much stronger. So I personally believe the efforts in the next 2 months should be how do we get back to where we were in January of this year? Because we were in a very strong position at the start of the year. We all genuinely believed that, we had done a great job of controlling the pandemic. We had actually done a great job of getting business back on its feet, and we must get back to that position. So I personally believe the next few months has to be about a mega effort and a very collaborative effort between the private and public sectors, between government and the private sectors, between center and states, to see how do we actually overcome this pandemic. And that is what will decide whether we lose our competitive edge or whether we gain it.
Thanks. Malika, I'd like to turn to you. When we talk about competitiveness, we talk about a nation's competitiveness, we talk about a sector's competitiveness, but we can also talk about an individual company's competitiveness. And I know that you have taken the opportunity of this year to look very closely at your own internal processes, and you've gained market share in India. And I'd like to ask you what efforts you've made as a company to improve your own competitiveness and what lessons other companies can draw from the exercise that you've undertaken.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, much has been said about the opportunities for India as a country and the growth for the IT sector, the pharma sector. But if you really look at the manufacturing sector and particularly our industry, I think you made a reference to the company, we had a robust year. We had a very robust year. No doubt, industry demand was driven by fairly strong rural incomes. But in the middle of that, of the challenges that exist, in order to take advantage of this opportunity, I think there has been an approach that has been required, agility, resourcefulness, innovation in many ways, in order to fundamentally change. And I think the pandemic has given us some very key insights on how we can fundamentally change the competitive position. Almost every block in the value chain has gone through some transformation. And then maybe I'll share some insights with respect, because it's never going to be business as before. So I'd like to therefore maybe share some insights that perhaps businesses, if they incorporate, will emerge, and I'm very confident we will emerge as a more competitive looking past the COVID period as we get over this. And the first thing I'd like to share is really about consumer behavior. Consumer behavior has changed in a very fundamental way. India has so far been a country that has focused on value. Value was a very key driving, decision-driving proposition, but the emphasis has changed, and quality and convenience have come to the forefront. Almost 94% of India's consumers have tried a new buying behavior, either a new store, a new brand, a new way, and I think we cannot ignore this. So that's one. Second, even in the online purchasing, it has gone so far that where we thought it was unimaginable before the pandemic, and we classified some sectors as high contact, high touch areas in terms of the sales experience, take jewelry or automobiles, even that has undergone a very significant change. You've seen online, even offline buying, contactless sales, and curbside sales. We've seen consumer behavior change in a very fundamental. These are only some examples. Safety, health, quality, and convenience have overshadowed value. And I think this is somewhere which is going to dictate how our whole go-to-market, our entire GTM, has undergone already in the last 1 year a very significant change. And I think it's not something for future competitiveness that we can choose to ignore. That's one example. And the second example I'd like to touch upon is really, I know we talked about global supply chains earlier in the conversation. And to me, I think there's been the experience has been a fundamental rethink on cost and efficiency and a global supply chain that was driving manufacturing around the world for all of these years and for many decades. I know it has been questioned even before the pandemic in terms of trade tensions, in terms of Brexit, etc. But I think at an individual company level, it's forced us to rethink the balance between efficiency, lean efficiency and cost, and risk mitigation. It's exposed a lot of vulnerabilities, and we're having to go through balance. So as we put these insights, and but as we put these insights together, there is a fundamental transformation in our approach and strategy. And if we can incorporate this, I think we are emerging more competitive. And I'm very optimistic about that.
Thank you. I was going to ask a third question, but it seems to be that my question is also on many of the minds of the readers. So I think that I will start to go directly to some of the reader questions and maybe come back a bit. I'll read some of them here and throw them to one of you. Most of you appear to be painting an optimistic picture, but as private citizens, we see a failure of leadership and management of the crisis. Lack of understanding of the science, indifferent supply chain management, poor hospital preparedness. What role can industry play to fill this gap? Kieran, would you take that question?
Yes, I think this is actually a time when we need to work together. I think industry has to basically work hand in hand with public policy makers, because this is the time for coming up with very rapidly designed new algorithms and paradigms with which to deal with the pandemic. The importance of this phase of pandemic management has to be about rapid response, and that rapid response should not be a knee-jerk reaction, but a well thought out rapid response. And for that, I think you need both private and public partnership to evolve such measures. So I, for one, believe that, yes, I think this is a great adversity for the country, but it is also a great opportunity for a very strong public-private partnership. And this is a time when it cannot be a centralized approach. I personally keep repeating that. It should be a decentralized approach, because we cannot fight such a massive pandemic with a command and control model. It has to actually be a decentralized model. And that's where the public-private partnership model will work very, very well in a decentralized way.
Amitabh, I wanted to ask you, even before the pandemic, India's economy was slowing down. Growth had been steadily losing momentum for 8 quarters prior to the hit from the virus. I wanted to ask you, and this is echoing a reader question, the reader asked, what are the 3 biggest challenges for our economy to come back to the new normal? What are the underlying structural issues that India needs to solve to fast track recovery from the crisis? And I would like to add, what were the underlying issues that were leading to a slowdown in growth prior to the pandemic? And what is the government's strategy for trying to tackle these issues?
So, Amy, I think one of the key challenges that we've seen countries across East and Southeast Asia transform themselves within a generation. And they've done it by just ushering reforms and policies to promote private sector-led growth and investment. And my personal view is that while India has witnessed a substantial transformation since the 90s, our average growth rate for the past 30 years has been about 6.6%. And investment rates as a percentage of GDP averaged, if you look at South Korea, for instance, was about 33%, 37% in China. In India's average investment rate has been a shade just around 30% in the 3 decades since 1990. And therefore, raising investment levels will be crucial to India's growth story going ahead. We need to raise productivity and efficiency. We need to become more innovative. We need to become competitive. And these, to my mind, are critical issues. Now, one of the key challenges to enhance private debt to GDP ratio. In India, the government debt to GDP ratio is high, the private debt to GDP ratio is low. And therefore, it's very important that we push for greater amount of flow of credit to the private sector. And I think the reforms that were carried out earlier and the reforms which must get accelerated and the push for infrastructure and the fact that now government has decided that the debts have been cleared for asset monetization, that government which has built assets will sell them to the private sector and will do privatization, which should raise funds for the government, but also bring in efficiency through private sector participation. It should boost productivity and better management of these assets. And therefore, by creating an asset monetization pipeline and an infrastructure pipeline, I think we should really get the government out of business. The government should not be operating roads. The government should not be operating airports. The government should get a lot of private sector play in railway, running of trains, in managing of its railway stations, in warehousing. There is no need for all these warehouses to be run by a central warehousing corporation or for sports stadiums to be managed by government. All this must be managed by the private sector through a massive asset monetization program. And I think by announcing the disinvestment of 2 public sector banks and 1 insurance company, which we have already recommended from Niti Aayog, the names of these, I think we'll send out a very clear signal that India is willing to take very, very tough decisions to boost both investment and growth. And this is what is required at the political leadership, and will be more than willing to take these in the midst of this crisis.
Amitabh, one thing that we've seen in this crisis that the health sector, which is actually a heavily private dominated sector, I believe something like 50% of inpatient care is normally done by the private sector, and even a greater percentage of outpatient care. But in this crisis, what we've seen is the health sector as it exists is not sufficient to cope with the huge health needs of the population. I mean, not only is it not able to cope with all the pandemic, COVID patients, but anyone else with any other health problem at this particular point of time cannot access healthcare at all. My question is, what is the government's strategy for strengthening the healthcare infrastructure of this country? This is actually a reader question. A participant question. What is the government doing to improve healthcare infrastructure? And, is it just going to say, well, the market will provide healthcare, or are there some other concrete solutions that the government is pursuing? We know that the public healthcare sector has been chronically underfunded with just about 1% of GDP. So what is the government's, I think that's really put a spotlight. It's fine for the government to get out of roads and running airports, but it's obvious that whatever's happening in the healthcare sector right now is not adequate.
So, Ami, I'm a long-term believer that it's not possible to have sustained growth over a long period of time without a government putting its resources into health, education, and nutrition. And it's very, very important that government must get out of all other sectors but focus on health, education, and nutrition. And I'm a believer that government must invest close to about 5% of its GDP on health in the coming years. And I'm a believer that what the government has been doing in the last 2 years, for instance, it focused on strengthening the primary health and wellness center, 150,000 of them. That program must be accelerated. The government spent money in the Jan Arogya Yojana, that Ayushman Bharat, the PMJAY, where it insured 500 million Indians. It's the biggest insurance scheme in the world, health insurance scheme in the world, and totally digital, paperless, cashless. And that is why I think states which, but health is not just a central government subject, it's a state subject as well. So states must come forward and take the lead in investing in social infrastructure. And I think even in these sectors, there's a massive scope for a private-public partnership. More than ever before, I think the importance of social infrastructure, such as healthcare facilities, has come to the fore. And unlocking investments in the sector, both by government and private sector, will be absolutely crucial to India's resilience and its adaptability.
Amitabh, one more question for you as the government. Basically, somebody says, how wise was it to allow large religious festivals and political rallies earlier this year before the second wave hit?
Well, we are a very, we are one of the democratic countries, and elections are a very integral part of democracy, and you have to have them before the end of 5 years period. But that was a call taken by the Election Commission of India. I think probably we could have done it with much greater level of discipline. And I think instead of just blaming the government and instead of blaming institutions, I would tend to blame the people of India also. All of us need to be far more responsible. I think the masking up is the best social vaccine. As we accelerate the process of vaccination in India, and it will get accelerated in a big way in the next couple of months, as we've gone down to 18 plus now, the challenge would be really that there would be demand supply issues, and in the meanwhile, it's very important that the people of India become disciplined. And they must mask up, they must maintain physical distancing, they must do social and physical distancing. And that is really the key thing. It's the community. This battle cannot be fought by the government alone. This battle has to be fought in, as Kiran rightly said, in a very, very decentralized manner, but with a lot of community participation. Community participation holds the key to the success of this managing this pandemic. And therefore, every individual, every community, every locality, every village, every panchayat must play a very critical and significant role in this.
All right, I'm afraid, although there's many other questions, and I think many people, Kiran, I don't, might have more to say if you have any last quick words. But otherwise, I'm afraid we're actually just running out of time. So as usual with these panels, we have fantastic speakers, lots of people with lots of great insights. I wish we could go on, but I think I have to wrap it up here, and thank all of you for joining us. And I'm sure these kinds of conversations will be continuing in boardrooms and government offices and among Indians for many weeks to come. And for now, all I can do is thank you all for participating with us, and for all those who have signed in and joined this talk. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thanks.